Hi, I'm Dr. David Nowell. I want to share a few slides that we didn't get around to in the webinar yesterday. I had a couple of email inquiries about that, so let me just share those with you here. This will only make sense if you're at the webinar yesterday. We talked about non-medical interventions for treatment of ADHD and the ways in which those interventions actually change brain function for the purpose of supporting long-term executive functioning. What we did yesterday was we did a tour of neuroanatomy in 60 slides using a couple of brain models. We did a discussion of ADHD that I called ADHD 301, so a graduate level discussion of ADHD. And then we moved on to discuss comprehensive treatment, especially behavioral interventions. We said there are 5 lifestyle practices, keystone practices for living well with ADHD. And over the course of the day, I shared a strategy for supporting metacognition that I call strategic behavioral inquiry, which is essentially asking, as this mnemonic reminds us, how exactly did you do that? So at the point that I skipped a few slides, we had been reviewing antecedent supports, that is, bottom-up supports, trying to create a classroom, a home, a universe where people with executive dysfunction perform at their very best. And then we had moved on to say, what are the actual behaviors that we want folks eventually to master? So this is top down, doing it with your own cortex, your own thinking. I suggested making your bed may not be the most important skill and behavior, but there may be behaviors that you really need to be a healthy, high-functioning 26-year-old. The ability to start and stop and repair conversations, the ability to manage time, the ability to regulate mood. Here's where we skipped a few slides. Let me ask you to consider the times during the day when you are on the computer and you become aware that you're off task. Let me say it again. This is very personal. Think about the times that you're performing some task on your computer and you become aware that you're off task. You're distracted. You're wasting time. My question of you is, how do you do that? I'm not asking how does one do that. I'm asking, how do you become aware that you're off task? Some people say that they actually see themselves as though they're dissociating. Some people say that they see the clock and you can see them pointing with their hand to the clock where you'd see it on the laptop. For me, it's a real kinesthetic awareness. I love wasting time on the internet. And then at some point, I get a tension in my shoulders and chest. I get a heat in my cheeks, and then a primitive shame sensation, like a heavy fishing weight on a line. When I get those 3 sensations in my body, I'm like, hello, old friends. I know what this means. I'm wasting time. When you become aware that you're off task, you are free to determine if I'll persist with my time waster or do something useful. So this is gorgeous. I think you could see I would never teach somebody how to have shame and tension because maybe that's not the way you do it. Plus, it's not nice, but it's the way I do it. So I'm asking you, if you're going to teach folks who are struggling with distractibility, I might ask first, can you describe how you do that? One way to support this capacity is called distraction delay training. Let's imagine that you are my 14-year-old, and I know that you tend to get distracted doing homework. You sit down tonight at 6:30. You want to watch TV with your sister at 8. You start homework at 6:30. I know from experience that you tend to get distracted. I want to support you in developing the executive skill, the top-down behavior of being able to bring yourself back on task, noticing that you are off task and coming back to task. So I'm going to sit with you near your study area tonight with a stopwatch or a timer, and I want to see how long you can work at a stretch before you are distracted. So how long do you think, as a 14-year-old, that you can work on this homework, non-preferred task, before you become distracted? 10 minutes. Okay, let's see. So you go to work and I time you. When I see that you're off task, I'll stop you and say, okay, that's good. You went for 8 minutes. I want to see if we can go even longer. But before I start the timer again, I want to ask you something. Before I told you you were off task, did you already know? Did you have any awareness? Did you see or hear or feel anything that let you know you were off task? And you'll say, Dad, you're so old and weird. Okay. I mean, you're 14. I've got 4 more years before you leave home. We've got time to practice this. Let's do it again. Go to work. I'm going to start the timer. And then when I see that you are off task, I stop the timer. All right, that was good. That was 9 minutes, a little bit longer. Now, before I start the timer again, let me ask that same question. Did you know you were off task? I'm hoping that at some point before you leave home, you'll develop an awareness. So for me, it's tension, heat, and shame. For somebody else, it's they hear their own voice saying, "What are you doing?" Maybe for you, it's, "Hey, Dad, right before you told me I was off task, I noticed that my shoulders were collapsed, and I was thinking of my homework as a big white mountain." You can't put that toothpaste back in the tube. You've got collapsed shoulders and big white mountain. That's how you know, I'm about to get off task. Some people will never develop this capacity. They don't know they're off task until somebody comes by the office and says, "Are you going to the meeting?" They don't know they're off task until they have so many tabs open that their browser crashes. So if you can't develop the top-down capacity, are there some bottom-up supports, some antecedent or environmental supports that could help this? Well, there are. One of them is an elegant Android app called the Stay on Task app. It does one thing. It runs quietly in the background, and at random intervals, the screen will pop up and simply asks you to choose. Are you on task or off? If you select off task, it doesn't say, "Why can't you be like your sister?" It just says, "Okay, get back to work." Now, I don't need the Stay on Task app because I've got tension, heat, and shame. I mean, that pops up for me from time to time. But for somebody who hasn't developed that awareness yet, this may be a way of saying, "Hey, there's no such thing as procrastination. There's just choosing and choosing again." And this thing that you're doing right now, no shame, no blame. You're making a Spotify list with song titles based on days of the week. Monday, Friday, I'm in love, Tuesday's girl. That's great. Is this the thing you want to be doing right now? In each choice point, I'm determining my outcome. I'm going to get better and better at Spotify playlists, or I'm going to get better and better at geometry. Is this the choice you want to make right now? There is not an iPhone version of that Stay on Task app. That's an Android app. There is an app called the Motivator. If you remember, Motivator made this device in the 80s that you wore like a beeper on your belt and it buzzed on occasion. It's been adapted for a smartphone, and it does something similar to Stay on Task. It's not quite as simple and elegant. Sometimes there's value in taking these strategies off the phone for all sorts of reasons. So the Revive device comes in different colors. I've chosen evening black. Does that go? I think it goes. The way the Revive works is, Karen, this is the class where you really tend to get distracted. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this Revive on your wrist, and then once I turn it on, at random intervals, it will buzz twice, 3 times, kind of random. And when you feel that vibration, it's just a chance to ask yourself, am I on task right now? Now again, I don't need the Revive because I've got tension, heat, and shame. And you might not need the Revive because you've got the voice in your head, or you can see the clock, or whatever your strategy it is. But the purpose of this is to give some support to help people direct themselves back on task. You're either going to do it totally independently, top down, or you're going to need some environmental support. The Revive is antecedent support. It's bottom up, right? It's your body. For me, the tension, the heat, the shame, I do it totally independently. That's top down. Now, when we get distracted over the course of the day, it's great to have some ritual. Some people might press their tongue against the back of their teeth just as a way of restarting. One ritual that I use when I feel like I've gotten scattered is I do the breath of fire, and I just do 5 of them. I can't believe I'm doing this on video. I usually do this in private. It's deep belly breaths, and it will sort of hit reset. There's lots of good yogic reasons to do this kind of breathing. I simply use it as a ritual to sort of reset myself and say, okay, now let me restart afresh. There are some slides I skipped at the end. I don't know if you noticed that, but I'll go ahead and pop through those now. All day long, I discussed ADHD as a discrepancy between ability and performance. Folks with ADHD can be bright, entrepreneurial, creative, and they can focus on something when they're interested. But performance, consistent performance, Monday through Friday, 8 to 3, that may be the problem. This gap is a source of shame. It's a source of temptation to give up. Oh, I tried that and it didn't work. It's a source of disappointment. It's also a source of labeling, lazy, spacey. This gap can actually impact your assessment. If you do ADHD evaluations, you have sometimes found at the very end, maybe at the feedback session, something the client didn't tell you. I didn't mention this to you, but twice I've had my car repossessed. I had the money, I just let the bills pile up, and I remember once hiding in the kitchen when the repo man came to get my car, and I gently looked out, peeked behind the curtains, and cried. And I'm like, it's interesting that you didn't tell me that. And they'll say, well, on your checklist, there was no item that said, have you ever hid behind the curtains and cried when the repo man came to your house? Our checklist really don't tap into the stories, the personal heartbreaking stories that can be the source of shame. They can be buried deep within our client's history, and they can be so shameful that sometimes they won't even tell us. Some therapeutic interventions around this gap. I think grief work is a missed opportunity. If you are a psychotherapist, you're trained to do trauma work. You've done work around loss and grief, and this is something that you bring to the table. So with a new ADHD diagnosis, we might just breathe, offer supportive eye contact, and say, let's talk about this. Now that you have this new way of understanding your brain, this is different from saying lazy and spacey. This is a neurological way of understanding you. What comes to mind? What stories? What labels? Let's touch base gently with all the things you've lost and are losing as a result of this gap. I also want to spend some time cataloging the positive features. If you don't know what they are, just jump onto a subreddit at about ADHD or any Facebook user group where adults with ADHD are laying claim to the gifts of this condition. I'm bright, I'm creative, I notice things that people miss. Make sure you catalog all that good stuff. And then there's a very concrete application that I use with kids and adults to assist with self-compassion. I call it the self-esteem abacus. So it's just a Melissa and Doug abacus that I've adapted by putting these little tabs along the 10 axes. And I allow my client to name these axes. So this one has friends, independence, appearance, girlfriend, kindness, intelligence. These are all different ways that my client defined himself and different sources of self-esteem. So I'll let your client determine what those axes will be. It's going to vary from person to person. But once we've determined your sources of self-esteem, we then do the exercise. We move beads on each axis to indicate how I feel about myself. How am I doing now in terms of my social circle, my independence? Where am I with that? My appearance. This particular client did not have a girlfriend and he really wanted one, so he had to give himself a 0 on that one. But he thought he was very kind. He actually thought he was a bit kinder than I might have rated him. Nonetheless, he gave himself an 8. And then intelligence, he gave himself a good number. And then we look at the beads and we go, there you go. There's your self-esteem abacus. Your self-esteem total doesn't derive from one thing like academics or dating life. If you've ever had a tough breakup, it feels like all of your self-esteem derives from that one axis, but it doesn't. There's lots of other ways that you derive self-esteem. And if one of them isn't going well, look at the others. If you want to feel better about yourself, we need to move some beads. So how could you be a better friend? How could you be more independent? And so forth. Well, that's the slides we missed yesterday. Thank you for inquiring about that and caring enough to ask me about those. And feel free to shoot me email, david@drnowell, with any questions, or direct message me at Twitter. I'm @DavidNowell. Thanks a lot.